Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into the strange, foggy science of how pirates actually found their way across open ocean with no satellites, no GPS, and for most of the so-called Golden Age, no reliable way to even fix their longitude within 100 miles of the truth. We're talking about a knotted rope thrown off the stern, a sandglass that ran for exactly 28 seconds and not a heartbeat longer, and a stolen Spanish notebook of sailing directions that in 1681 was considered valuable enough to help keep a pirate captain off the gallows. Welcome to the world of magnetic compasses that quietly lied to everyone using them, sun sights taken with an instrument you weren't even supposed to look through directly, and captains who bet 300 lives on a pencil mark that could be wrong by 60 miles in either direction. Go ahead and dim the lights if you haven't already, and if you'd like, let a fan hum low in the background tonight. Something steady and a little restless, like wind filling a sail that hasn't seen land in 3 weeks. You're warm right now, in a bed that isn't moving under you. That won't be true for anyone in tonight's story. So get comfortable, let your shoulders go heavy, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The smell hits you before anything else does. Tar, warmed by the sun until it goes soft and faintly sweet, mixed with the sourness of bilge water nobody has pumped out in 2 days, and underneath both of those, the salt itself, which after a while stops smelling like anything at all and just becomes the smell of breathing. That's the inside of an early 18th century pirate sloop, somewhere out past sight of land, and it's the air you're going to be living inside for the next several weeks, because you've just been handed the single most important piece of equipment on the entire ship. It isn't a cutlass. It isn't a pistol. It's a wooden board about the size of a small tea tray, drilled with rows of holes radiating out like the spokes of a wheel, fitted with a scatter of small wooden pegs on short lengths of string. This is the traverse board, and if you drop it over the side in a squall, the ship is, for practical purposes, blind, every half hour. When the ship's boy flips a small glass and calls out the time in a voice that's cracking somewhere between a child's and a man's, someone walks to this board and pushes a peg into the hole, marking the compass course steered and the estimated speed for that half hour. By the end of a 4-hour watch, the pattern of pegs scattered across the board is, quite literally, the only surviving record of where the ship has been, and by extension, the only clue anyone has about where it might be now. No satellite is checking this math. No shore station is checking this math. You are the checking. Here's the thing about the compass you're steering by, the one bolted into its brass gimbal so it stays level no matter how hard the deck pitches. It's lying to you. Gently. Constantly, and in 1718, nobody fully understands why. The needle, a sliver of iron stroked repeatedly against a lodestone until it holds a weak magnetic charge, points not at true geographic north, but at magnetic north, and the gap between the two, a quantity sailors call variation, changes depending on where in the world you happen to be floating that week. English navigators of the period know the effect is real. They've measured it in specific, well-travelled harbours and copied the numbers dutifully into their rutters and sailing directions. What they do not have, because it won't exist for another century and a half, is a working theory of terrestrial magnetism that would let them predict variation reliably in unfamiliar water. So every time your ship crosses into a stretch of ocean nobody aboard has sailed before, that trusted needle on the binnacle starts drifting a few degrees off true without so much as a warning creak, and the officer reading it has absolutely no way of knowing by how much. Congratulations, you've inherited a compass that tells confident half-truths for a living. The joke that circulates below decks, dry and worn smooth from overuse, is that the compass always knows exactly where north is. It simply refuses, out of some private malice, to ever say so plainly. By your 3rd day out of sight of land, you meet Josiah Fenn, the man actually responsible for casting the log every half hour, day and night, in fair weather and foul, and he is, without much competition, the most anxious person aboard. Josiah is somewhere past 40, weathered the colour of old rope, missing the top joint of 2 fingers on his left hand from a line burn nobody has bothered to explain to you in detail, and he has the habit of muttering the count under his breath a second time, even after he's already called it out loud to the officer of the watch, as though repeating it might make the number more true. His job looks deceptively simple from a distance. A small wooden quarter circle called the log chip, weighted along its curved edge so it drags flat and resistant in the water instead of skipping across the surface, is tied to the end of a long line marked at intervals with knots spaced roughly 7 feet 3 inches apart, a distance chosen very deliberately by earlier generations of navigators doing arithmetic with a 28-second sandglass. Josiah heaves the chip off the stern, lets the line run free through the 2 damaged fingers that make the job hurt every single time, and counts how many knots slip past his hand in exactly 28 seconds, timed by a second man holding the small glass at eye level and calling the moment the last grain falls. That count, multiplied out by the arithmetic built into the spacing itself, becomes the ship's speed in nautical miles per hour. It is, incidentally, exactly why sailors still measure speed in knots today, 3 centuries after Josiah's actual. Physical knots of rope stopped mattering to anyone but historians and people like you, listening in the dark. What Josiah's method cannot account for, no matter how carefully he counts, is everything that moves a ship, besides its own sails pushing against still water. Ocean currents drag the hull sideways for hours at a time without leaving a single mark on the log line, because the log chip is measuring the ship's speed relative to the water around it, not relative to the seafloor or the fixed earth beneath that water. Leeway, the sideways slip caused by wind shoving against the hull and rigging from an angle, has to be estimated entirely by eye, by an experienced sailor squinting at the pale wake trailing off the stern and guessing how many degrees off the ship's steered course she's actually crawling. There is no instrument for this. There is only a man's trained opinion, built out of years of watching wakes and getting it wrong slowly enough to eventually get it less wrong, and that opinion gets written onto the traverse board with exactly the same confident, ink-dark certainty as the hard numbers sitting right next to it. Here's what nobody tells the new hands on their first week aboard. The entire system has a name: Dead Reckoning, and the word dead almost certainly began life as a clerk's lazy abbreviation of deduced reckoning. Dead Reckoning, worn down over generations of hurried handwriting into a word that, given what happens when the reckoning turns out to be wrong, feels uncomfortably well chosen either way. By your second week out, the small errors have started compounding in a way that would genuinely frighten you if you understood the arithmetic involved, which, mercifully, in the way that ignorance is sometimes its own kind of mercy, you don't. A half-degree of misjudged leeway here, an unaccounted current there, invisible and patient, nudging the hull a mile off course for every 4 hours it runs unnoticed. A helmsman who steers 2 full degrees wide of the ordered heading because the compass card is nearly impossible to read by lantern light at 4 a.m. during the middle watch, when even the most disciplined man's attention starts to slide. None of these mistakes, taken alone, amounts to much. Stacked together across 10, 12, 20 days without a landfall to check against, they add up fast. Surviving ship's logs from the period suggest that dead reckoning positions on a long ocean passage of several weeks with nothing solid to correct the running estimate could plausibly drift anywhere from 20 to well over 100 nautical miles off the true position. On a coast littered with reefs, shifting sandbars, and the kind of low grey islands that don't announce themselves on the horizon until the lookout is already close enough to smell the surf breaking on them, that margin of error is not an abstract inconvenience tucked away in a footnote. It is the entire plot of a chapter you're going to hear later tonight, and it is the exact reason every experienced sailing master aboard treats a clear noon sunsight, on the rare day the sky actually cooperates, like something close to a small miracle handed down from above. What actually holds this fragile, error-riddled system together isn't any single brilliant instrument. It's redundancy, and it's a very particular kind of institutional stubbornness. Every officer capable of doing the arithmetic keeps his own private, independent reckoning scratched into a personal notebook, so that when the sailing master's estimate and the quartermaster's estimate, and the captain's own gut, feeling all disagree by 15 or 20 miles, which happens constantly, someone in the argument can push the ship's official position back toward the safer, more conservative number. Your ship's articles, the written contract every man aboard has signed his mark to before ever sailing, don't mention navigation once in their entire text. But they say a great deal, in blunt and specific language, about what happens to a man judged responsible for losing the ship through carelessness, and that unspoken threat sits quietly behind every peg pushed into that traverse board, whether anyone says it aloud or not. There's a strange kind of comfort buried in that arrangement, if you look at it sideways. Nobody aboard trusts any one tool completely. Everybody aboard is, in effect, watching everybody else's math, cross-checking it against their own, and that overlapping web of doubt is, in the total absence of anything more precise, probably the closest thing to a real safety system this ship actually has. 3 weeks out, in the flat grey hour just before dawn, when the whole world seems to be holding its breath, a squall catches the ship broadside without warning while Josiah is mid-cast, line running free through his hand. The sudden wave slams the logline taut against the hull and very nearly takes his damaged fingers the rest of the way off at the second joint. He doesn't lose the fingers, in the end, though the pain of it doubles him over against the taffrail for a long, ugly minute. He does lose the count entirely, and with it, the last confirmed speed reading recorded before the storm scrambles everyone's sense of the ship's true course for the better part of 6 chaotic hours. Sails backed and retrimmed twice, the helmsman fighting a wheel that keeps trying to spin itself out of his hands. When the weather finally breaks toward full daylight, the sailing master has to reconstruct those missing 6 hours almost entirely from memory. The general feel of the wind against his own face during the worst of it, Josiah's shaky half-guessed estimate of how hard the ship had been running before the line tore free of his grip. It isn't really science at that point, if it ever fully was. It's closer to a kind of practiced, communal faith, 3 tired men agreeing out loud on a shared story about where the ship probably is. Because the only alternative on offer is admitting, to themselves and to 80 other men depending on them, that nobody actually knows. There's a second instrument you inherit that week, one that gets far less attention in the stories told about pirates than the cutlass or the black flag ever does: the lead line. It's exactly what it sounds like, a length of rope with a heavy lead weight at the end, hollowed out at the bottom and packed with a lump of tallow ordinary cooking fat, pressed in like a plug. When the ship edges into water shallow enough to worry anyone, a sailor swings the lead out ahead of the bow and lets it sink to the bottom, calling out the depth in fathoms marked by knots and bits of leather tied into the line at regular intervals. But the tallow does something the depth number alone can't. Whatever the lead touches down on, sand, mud, broken shell, gravel, sticks to the fat and comes back up with it, and an experienced sailing master can read that smear of seabed the way you might read a street sign. Fine white sand off a particular stretch of Carolina coast means one thing. Black mud laced with broken shell off a different inlet means something else entirely. It's an unglamorous piece of equipment, greasy and unpleasant to handle, and it has almost certainly kept more pirate crews alive than every pistol in the arms chest combined, because it tells you what dead reckoning simply cannot, not where you think you are, but what's actually under the hull right now, this instant, before you find out the hard way. By the time you're a full month into the voyage, the small, grinding stress of never quite being certain has settled into something closer to background noise, the way a toothache eventually stops announcing itself every waking second and just becomes a dull hum you've learned to work around. Here's the thing that surprises you most. Watching the officers argue in low voices over the chart table each noon, nobody aboard actually wants a single, simple, definitive answer to where the ship is. What they want, and what they've built this whole clumsy, overlapping system to produce, is several imperfect answers they can compare against each other. The captain's reckoning says one position, the sailing master's says another, 4 miles to the northwest. The quartermaster, who has his own reasons to distrust both men equally, keeps a third figure entirely, and it's the disagreement itself, not any one man's confidence, that keeps the ship cautious in exactly the waters where caution matters most. A crew that trusted its instruments completely would be a crew that stopped posting a careful lookout. Nobody aboard your ship has that luxury, and, as it turns out, that shared and permanent uncertainty is doing more to keep everyone alive than any single tool ever could on its own. Word reaches your deck one grey afternoon, second-hand, the way most real news travels at sea. A passing fisherman's boat, hailed and boarded without much fuss, brings a story about a merchant ship out of Bristol that went hard aground on a shoal 2 years back, not far from waters your own vessel is currently working through. Her reckoning off by what the fisherman swears was nearly 40 miles after 3 weeks without a single clear sun sight. Nobody aboard your ship can confirm the details. Nobody particularly needs to. The story does exactly the work it's meant to do, passed man to man along the rail in the hour before the evening watch changes, each retelling adding a little more weight to the same simple, unspoken point. This could be any of us, on any night the sky stays clouded over long enough. Your captain, hearing the tale second-hand from the boatswain, says nothing for a long moment, then orders an extra man posted forward at the bow through the night. Doubled watches, no explanation needed beyond the story itself. That's how a piece of navigational caution actually spreads on a ship like this. Not through a manual, through a story told at the rail about someone else's ship. By your 6th week aboard, you've learned the one ritual that outranks every other piece of navigation aboard this ship, the noon sight. Or at least the attempt at one. Every clear day, weather permitting, the sailing master climbs to a steady spot on deck sometime before midday and waits, instrument in hand, for the sun to reach its highest point in the sky, the moment it stops climbing and starts, almost imperceptibly, to sink again. That single moment, whenever the clouds actually allow it, resets everything. It gives the ship a fresh, independent fix on its latitude, a number pulled straight from the sky rather than guessed from rope and sand, and for a few hours afterward, the whole vessel seems to breathe a little easier. The accumulated week of doubt wiped provisionally clean. On the days the sky stays grey from dawn until dusk, and there are more of those days than anyone aboard would like, the ship simply keeps sailing on yesterday's numbers, or the numbers from 3 days ago, or however far back the last clear noon happened to fall. The bad news is obvious enough. A ship can go a week, 10 days, sometimes longer, without a single usable sight, trusting nothing but Josiah's knots and a pegboard the entire time. The good news, such as it is that everyone aboard already knows exactly how much to trust that stretch of blind sailing, and adjusts their nerves, their lookouts, and their caution accordingly, the way you'd walk more carefully across a floor you already knew had a rotten board in it somewhere. There is one more piece of paper worth mentioning before this particular watch ends. And it isn't a chart exactly. Not yet. It's a rutter, sometimes called by its older Dutch name, a wagoner, after Lucas Janszoon Wagenaar, the 16th century Dutch cartographer whose 1584 Sea Atlas became so influential that English sailors simply started calling any book of coastal sailing directions a wagoner regardless of who actually wrote it. Your ship carries one, salt-stained and missing its back cover, copied by hand from an English printing decades old, listing landmarks, depths, tidal timings, and known hazards for stretches of coast the captain has sailed before. It is, in its own modest way, more valuable to this crew than a chest of coin, because coin can't tell you where the sandbar sits off a headland you've never seen in daylight. What it cannot do, what no rutter aboard an English or colonial ship of this period can reliably do, is describe coastlines the Spanish crown has spent a century and a half working very hard to keep secret. The long, rich shoreline of its own Pacific and Caribbean territories, guarded not by soldiers alone, but by the simple, stubborn refusal to let accurate charts of it leave Spanish hands. Somewhere out past the horizon your ship is currently crawling toward, a version of that secret exists on paper, locked in a captain's strongbox aboard a ship that has no idea it's about to lose it. And that, in the end, is what you carry away from your weeks learning the logline and the pegboard, and the compass that never quite tells the whole truth. This entire fragile system, threaded together out of knotted rope, warmed wax, magnetized iron filings, and one anxious man's permanently damaged hand, is not some crude guess dressed up to look like science. It is, in fact, the best science available anywhere in the world in 1718, applied by people who understood its exact limits better than almost anyone alive, precisely because their lives depended on respecting how wrong it could quietly become. There is something close to tenderness in that kind of hard-won humility, worn by men with cutlasses on their belts and blood already on some of their hands. The tools were never going to be perfect, and everyone aboard already knew it. What mattered, what actually kept the ship afloat night after night, was that the men reading those tools never once let themselves forget it. And when a pegboard and a knotted rope finally stopped being enough, when a crew needed to know not just how far they'd sailed, but exactly what waited for them past a horizon none of them had ever crossed before, pirates did what pirates have always done best when they wanted something they didn't have. They didn't sit down and invent a better instrument. They went out and stole one, off the deck of a ship that had spent 100 years learning secrets it never meant to share. That theft very nearly didn't happen at all, because for one long, careless minute in 1681, the men who needed those secrets most almost threw them into the sea with their own hands. A sailor stood at the rail of a captured Spanish vessel somewhere off the Pacific coast of South America, an armful of leather-bound books balanced against his hip, and made ready to pitch the whole lot overboard. To him, thumbing quickly through pages dense with unfamiliar Spanish script, ornate hand-drawn coastlines, and small painted compass roses, the books looked like nothing more than Catholic missals, the kind of dense, unreadable devotional clutter that turned up on every Spanish prize and was worth exactly nothing to an English buccaneer a very long way from home. According to the journal kept by Basil Ringrosse, one of the men aboard that day, it took another crewman, sharper-eyed or simply luckier, to recognise the drawings for what they actually were before the first book ever hit the water. These weren't prayer books. They were derroteros, secret Spanish sailing directions and charts of an entire coastline, the kind of document the Spanish crown had spent the better part of a century and a half trying to keep out of every foreign hand in the world. This is the story of those captured charts, sometimes called the South Sea Wagoner once English hands got hold of them, and how a single act of nearly committed destruction ended up handing a struggling band of English buccaneers something more valuable, in the long run, than every ounce of silver they'd come looking for. To understand how that moment came to happen at all, you have to go back roughly a year, to April of 1680, when a mixed force of English and French buccaneers, somewhere between 300 and 400 men by most surviving accounts, hauled their canoes and provisions across the mountainous, fever-ridden isthmus of Darien on the narrow neck of land connecting the Americas. They weren't the first to try it, and they weren't especially well prepared even by the loose standards of the buccaneering world, but they had one clear goal: reach the Pacific, the South Sea as English sailors of the period called it, and raid the Spanish shipping that had grown fat and complacent on a coastline it assumed no European rival could ever reach by sea from that direction. Command of the expedition shifted hands violently and often. Captain Sawkins was killed attacking the town of Puebla Nueva. Other captains, disillusioned or simply outvoted, turned back toward the Caribbean rather than press on. What remained of the expedition eventually settled, by the crew's own vote, a detail worth sitting with for a moment. Under the command of a captain named Bartholomew Sharp, a hard, capable, and by most contemporary accounts deeply unpopular man tasked with keeping a shrinking, exhausted force alive on the wrong side of an entire continent. Here's the problem nobody aboard Sharp's ships had adequately solved before crossing that isthmus, and it's the exact problem that would define the rest of this chapter. They had almost no reliable charts of the coastline they now found themselves raiding. English cartography of the Pacific coast of South America in 1680 amounted to little more than educated guesswork stitched together from a handful of earlier voyages, decades old and thin on useful detail. Every bay, every hidden anchorage, every sandbar and reef the buccaneers needed to know to survive, let alone to fight, belonged to a body of knowledge the Spanish Empire had spent 150 years actively hoarding, copying its official derroteros by hand under lock, restricting their circulation even among its own captains, treating accurate charts of its Pacific possessions as a matter of state security roughly on par with a modern nation's classified defence documents. Sharp's men were, in the truest sense, sailing blind through someone else's carefully guarded backyard, and every single Spanish ship they captured got searched, first and foremost, for exactly the kind of paper that had almost gone over the rail in the scene that opens this story. In short, they were trying to rob houses on a street where every window was blacked out, and the only floor plans that existed belonged to the people they were robbing. For the better part of a year after crossing the isthmus, Sharp's small fleet worked its way down the coast of what is now Ecuador, Peru, and eventually Chile, picking fights it could win and running from the ones it couldn't. The record of that year, preserved largely through Basil Ringrose's journal and later folded into a published collection of buccaneer narratives, reads less like a triumphant campaign and more like an increasingly exhausted improvisation. Towns were raided for what coin and supplies they held. Small Spanish coasting vessels were stopped and searched, more often than not for food and water rather than treasure, because a fleet this far from any friendly port lived or died on its ability to resupply from the very people trying to kill it. Along the way, a much younger William Dampier sailed among Sharp's crew, decades before the voyages and the widely read travel books that would eventually make him one of the most respected navigational writers in England. Nobody aboard in 1681 had any reason to think the quiet, observant young buccaneer taking his own private notes belonged among the officers making the real decisions. That would come later, and it belongs to a different chapter of tonight's story. By the time Sharp's ships cornered the vessel that would matter most, sometime in the middle of 1681, the crew had grown practiced, almost businesslike, at the routine of boarding a prize and stripping it of anything useful within the hour. Provisions first. Coin and plate second. And then, almost as an afterthought most of the time, whatever paperwork happened to be sitting in the captain's cabin, more often than not genuinely worthless to men who couldn't read Spanish legal documents and had no patience for sorting through them carefully. This time was different, though nobody realised it in the first few minutes. Among the captain's effects sat a stack of leather-bound volumes, and it's here that the scene you heard at the very start of this chapter actually unfolds. A sailor, working fast, judged the book's religious clutter and moved to pitch them over the rail into water that was, by most reckonings, several miles deep at that point along the coast. Had he succeeded, this would be a very short chapter about a promising lead that came to nothing. It didn't happen that way. According to the account preserved in Ringrose's journal, another man aboard, sharper-eyed, or simply more curious, stopped him at the rail and asked to look through the books before they went into the water. What he found, once he actually opened the covers, were not prayers at all, but page after page of hand-drawn coastline, careful compass bearings, soundings marked in fathoms, and written sailing directions in Spanish covering enormous stretches of the Pacific coast the English had never been able to chart for themselves. Here's the thing about that near miss that's worth sitting with for a moment. An entire empire's worth of jealously guarded state secrets came within a single careless toss of vanishing forever into several miles of open ocean, saved not by any grand strategy, but by one buccaneer's idle curiosity about a stack of books somebody else had already decided were worthless. History, it turns out, occasionally hinges on exactly that thinner margin. Word of what the books actually were spread through the ship fast, and by most accounts the mood aboard shifted almost immediately, the weary, grinding business of a long raiding campaign giving way, for a few hours at least, to something closer to genuine excitement. These derroteros didn't just describe the stretch of coast where the ship happened to be captured. They laid out, in painstaking hand-copied detail, a huge swath of the Pacific coastline the Spanish crown had spent generations keeping hidden from exactly the kind of men now holding it in their sunburned hands. For a fleet that had spent the better part of a year sailing half-blind through unfamiliar water, trusting little beyond a lead line, a compass that occasionally lied, and whatever second-hand rumour the last captured fisherman happened to offer, this was, in the truest sense of the word, priceless, not in gold, in something arguably more useful to men whose survival depended on not running aground on a reef nobody aboard had ever seen before. Sharp, by most surviving accounts a shrewd man whatever else his crew thought of him personally, understood immediately what he was holding, and the books went into careful keeping rather than the ordinary scramble of shared plunder. What followed was not a triumphant sail home. It was one of the most dangerous ocean passages available to any sailing ship of the period, made worse by a decision that had almost nothing to do with charts and everything to do with simple exhaustion. Rather than retrace the overland route back across the isthmus, Sharp's remaining crew, reduced by battle, disease, and desertion to a fraction of the force that had originally crossed into the Pacific, chose to sail south and round Cape Horn, the notoriously violent stretch of open ocean at the very tip of South America, where the Pacific and Atlantic meet in a swirl of currents, gale-force winds, and icebergs drifting up from the far south even in the warmer months. Few English ships had made that passage from west to east at all by 1681, and doing it in a battered, undermanned vessel, in winter conditions, with a crew already stretched thin by a year and a half of raiding, was less a calculated risk than a genuine gamble with the lives of every man aboard. Provisions ran desperately short. The cold, for men who'd spent most of the previous year sweating through equatorial raids, came as a genuine physical shock. Frostbite and short rations, doing damage that no cutlass wound ever managed. And through all of it, the captured Doroteros stayed dry, stayed guarded, stayed, by every account that survives, the one piece of cargo nobody aboard was willing to risk losing. Basil Ringrose's own journal, later folded into a published collection of buccaneer narratives that gave later generations most of what's actually known about this voyage, describes those weeks off the Horn in the kind of flat, exhausted detail that tends to be more convincing than any dramatic flourish could manage. Men stood watch in clothing never designed for genuine cold. Canvas and worn wool against wind that came off open Southern Ocean water with nothing to slow it down for thousands of miles. Rations, already thin from a year and a half of living off whatever the crew could take or trade for along the coast, stretched thinner still, and more than one man aboard, according to the surviving record, showed the first signs of scurvy before the ship finally turned north again into friendlier water. There's no dramatic rescue in this part of the story, no single turning point worth building toward. There's only a battered ship, a badly reduced crew, and a stack of leather-bound books kept dry through sheer stubbornness, inching north week after week through some of the worst ocean on the planet, carried forward by men who had, by that point, very little left to lose and everything still to prove. What kept that crew from simply falling apart under the weight of all that hardship wasn't discipline handed down from above in the ordinary naval sense. It was the same written articles that governed every decision this loosely organised fleet had made since crossing the isthmus in the first place, a voted captain, an agreed division of whatever they eventually brought home, and a shared understanding, however imperfect in practice, that the risk being shared out on that freezing deck came with a promised share of whatever reward waited at the end of it. It's easy, hearing this story centuries later, to picture buccaneering purely as chaos with a flag attached to it. The reality, at least aboard Sharp's ships through the worst of that Cape Horn crossing, looked more like a group of desperate, half-frozen men holding each other to a contract, because the contract, imperfect as it was, happened to be the only thing standing between them and complete collapse. They made it. That's not a small thing to say about a passage that swallowed plenty of better-equipped ships in the centuries surrounding it, and by the time Sharp's battered vessel finally worked its way back into English waters in early 1682, the crew that stumbled ashore was a fraction of the size it had been when it first crossed the isthmus nearly 2 years earlier. What waited for them on land wasn't a hero's welcome. It was, predictably enough, an Admiralty courtroom. Buccaneering in the Pacific whatever loose justification it operated under in practice, sat on distinctly shaky legal ground back in England, and Sharp found himself formally tried for piracy not long after making landfall, facing a charge that, if it stuck, ended in a rope rather than a pension. Here's the part of the story that tends to get repeated, with varying degrees of certainty. In almost every later account of the voyage, the captured Spanish charts, by then recognised as an extraordinary intelligence prize, are widely believed to have played some role in softening the case against him. Whether through direct royal interest or simply the practical calculation that hanging the one man who knew exactly how those charts had been obtained wasn't in anyone's strategic interest. Sharp was acquitted. The precise weight the charts carried in that outcome is something historians still debate rather than something anyone can state as flat, settled fact. But the timing and the obvious value of what he'd brought home made an impression that outlasted the trial itself by a very long way. The charts themselves went on to have a strange and genuinely well-documented second life. Copies were made, illuminated with careful, colourful detail by a cartographer named William Hack, who produced multiple manuscript versions of what became known in English circles as the South Sea Wagoner, presented to figures at the very top of English society, including, by most accounts, King Charles II himself. What had begun as a stack of books nearly thrown overboard by a bored sailor who mistook them for prayer volumes ended up bound in fine leather, painted by a professional hand, and shelved among the treasured possessions of a royal court, several surviving copies of which can still be found today in major manuscript collections. There's something worth sitting with in that particular arc. The single most valuable object Sharp's expedition carried home wasn't silver, wasn't coin, wasn't anything that could be spent or melted down. It was information, painstakingly hoarded by one empire for a century and a half, liberated more or less by accident, and it ended up shaping English understanding of the Pacific coastline for a full generation afterward. Long after every doubloon from that voyage had been spent, gambled away, or simply lost to time. Somewhere in the middle of all this, largely unremarked upon in the surviving accounts of the voyage itself, that quiet young buccaneer mentioned earlier, William Dampier, kept doing exactly what he'd apparently been doing the whole trip, watching, and writing things down that had nothing to do with plunder. Wind patterns. The colour and behaviour of the water in different stretches of ocean. The habits of currents nobody else aboard thought worth recording in detail. None of it mattered much to Sharp or to the ship's official log. It would matter a great deal, decades later, when that same careful habit of observation turned Dampier into one of the most respected writers on wind and sea conditions in the English-speaking world. A transformation that belongs properly to a much later part of tonight's story. For now, it's enough to notice that the same voyage that nearly lost a Spanish empire's secrets to idle boredom also happened to be quietly training the man who would go on to write some of the first systematic English accounts of how the world's oceans actually moved. History has a habit of planting its most important threads in the margins of stories that seem, at the time, to be about something else entirely. There's a quieter kind of hope buried in this story too, easy to miss under all the drama of near misses and royal courtrooms. A fleet that started this voyage with almost nothing reliable to navigate by, trusting rope and sand and a compass that occasionally lied, ended it holding the single most detailed set of Pacific charts available anywhere in the English-speaking world. Not because any one man was a genius, but because a crew bound together by written articles and a shared vote for command happened to include, among its exhausted, half-starved ranks, one man curious enough to open a book before throwing it away. It's a small kind of dignity, easy to overlook. But it's real, and it mattered more, in the long run, than any single cutlass swung on that entire voyage. It's worth pausing on just how far this particular piece of paper eventually travelled from that Pacific deck. William Hack's illuminated copies of the captured Doroteros didn't simply sit in a royal library gathering dust after their moment of court intrigue faded. Several manuscript versions were produced over the following years, each hand-painted each a small work of art in its own right, coastlines rendered in careful ink and watercolour by a professional cartographer who had never sailed a mile of the water he was drawing. Surviving copies still exist today, scattered across major manuscript collections, including the British Library, studied now by historians of cartography rather than admiralty judges. Valued for exactly the reason Sharp's crew valued them in the first place, they preserve an extraordinary hand-drawn detail, a picture of the Pacific coastline as the Spanish Empire understood it in the late 17th century, filtered through the hands of men who took it not for scholarship, but for survival. There's a particular kind of irony worth sitting with here, the sort this whole story seems built around. A document meant to stay locked inside one empire's administrative machinery forever ended up, through a chain of accidents, violence, and one sailor's idle curiosity, becoming one of the more thoroughly preserved records of its kind anywhere in the world, read today by exactly the kind of scholars the original Spanish clerks who drafted it never imagined, and certainly never intended. None of which, in the end, solved the deeper problem that had sent Sharp's crew fumbling half-blind across an unfamiliar coastline in the first place. A captured chart, however detailed, could only tell a sailor where the land was. It couldn't tell him, on a cloudy night 3 weeks from the nearest landmark, exactly where his own ship happened to be floating in the vast, featureless water between. For that, pirates needed to look somewhere no Spanish clerk had ever bothered to lock a door on, straight up, into a sky that, unlike the Spanish crown, had never once kept any of its secrets from anybody willing to learn how to read them. The glare hits you first, a hard white sting behind your eyes even with your back half turned to the sun, and you understand immediately why the older hands on this ship squint permanently, even below decks, even at night, as though the habit has simply carved itself into their faces. It's a few minutes before noon, and you've been handed an instrument you don't yet fully trust. A long wooden arc, roughly the size of a fireplace poker, fitted with sliding vanes, and a small shaded piece of glass. This is a backstaff, sometimes called a Davis quadrant after the English navigator John Davis, who worked out the design back in 1594 specifically to solve a problem that had been quietly blinding sailors for a generation. Here's the trick of it, and it's a genuinely clever one. Instead of staring directly into the sun to measure its height above the horizon, which is exactly what the older cross-staff instrument demands, the backstaff lets you stand with the sun at your back, casting its shadow onto a horizon vane, and read the sun's altitude off the shadow instead. Your eyes stay intact. Your latitude, with any luck, does not. Not every ship carries a backstaff, and yours, this particular voyage, still keeps an older cross-staff tucked in a chest below, a relic from an earlier era of nautical instruments, and, frankly, an occupational hazard dressed up as a measuring tool. Using one means sighting directly along a graduated staff toward both the sun and the horizon at once, lining up a sliding crosspiece by eye, which means, in blunt terms, staring almost straight at the sun for as long as it takes to get a clean reading. Do that often enough, year after year, voyage after voyage, and it costs you something permanent. You meet the man who'd know better than anyone aboard, Elias Pryor, the sailing master, somewhere past 50, who squints even in shadow and who you notice, within your first week under his instruction, seems to read distant sails a beat slower than the younger lookouts do. Nobody says the word aloud. Everybody aboard understands exactly what 2.5 decades of cross-staff sights, taken because the ship couldn't always afford or acquire the newer instrument, has quietly cost him. Elias walks you through the ritual itself that first clear noon, and it is, in its own way, the calmest 15 minutes of the entire ship's day. Every man not on essential duty who has an interest in navigation, and on a pirate vessel that can mean more people than you'd expect, since a share in the voyage's success tends to sharpen a man's curiosity about exactly where the ship is headed, gathers near the quarterdeck rail as the sun climbs toward its highest point. Elias takes his sight, calls the reading, and cross-checks it immediately against a printed almanac, a set of tables listing the sun's declination, its precise angular distance from the celestial equator, for every day of the year. Combine the measured angle with the tabled declination. Run a short piece of arithmetic that Elias can do now without conscious thought, and out comes the ship's latitude, its position north or south, fixed and confirmed for that single moment, independent of every guess Josiah's logline has produced over the preceding days. It's the one number aboard this ship that doesn't come from an estimate. It comes from the sky itself, and everyone treats it accordingly, with something close to reverence. By the second week of consistently clear skies, an increasingly rare stretch of good fortune this far into the season, you start to notice how the whole ship's rhythm bends itself around this ritual. Meals shift by 20 minutes, so nobody's clattering pans drown out Elias calling the count. Arguments about the previous night's dead reckoning get tabled, quite literally, until the noon sight settles the matter one way or another. Here's the thing about latitude, though, the thing that makes this whole careful ceremony only half the answer. It tells you how far north or south of the equator you are. Precisely, reliably, on any clear day. It tells you absolutely nothing about how far east or west you've travelled. You could take a perfect noon sight every single day for a month, and still have no better idea whether you're 40 miles or 400 miles off the coast you're trying to find. That other half of the puzzle, the part called longitude, is where this whole elegant system quietly falls apart, and it's the part that's kept every navigator aboard privately uneasy since the day the ship left port. By the time you're 3 weeks in, Elias teaches you the technique that actually makes this half-broken system workable for finding a specific, small island in an enormous ocean sailing down the latitude. Rather than plotting a direct course toward a destination, which would require knowing your longitude with a precision nobody aboard actually has. The ship instead sails until its noon sights confirm it has reached the exact latitude line the target island sits on, then turns and holds that line due east or west, trusting dead reckoning only to say roughly how far along it the ship has travelled, and trusting the lookout's eyes to do the rest. It's a clever workaround for a problem nobody can solve directly, the navigational equivalent of admitting you can't find a specific house on a specific street, so instead you find the right street first and simply walk its length until the house appears. Congratulations, you've just learned the same trick that guided treasure fleets, naval squadrons, and merchant convoys across every ocean on Earth for the better part of 3 centuries. All because measuring how far north you've gone turned out to be so much easier than measuring how far you've gone sideways. The book Elias guards almost as jealously as his own instruments is a printed almanac, its cover long since replaced with a plain leather wrap, its pages soft and grey at the corners from years of salt-damp handling. Inside sit the declination tables that make the noon sight mean anything at all, printed years earlier in London, the kind of practical navigational reference compiled by working sailing masters and mathematicians of the period for exactly this purpose. A ship without a current almanac is, in a real sense, only half a ship, capable of measuring an angle in the sky, but unable to translate that angle into a usable position without the tables to check it against. More than one prize taken by pirate crews of this era gets boarded not for the coin in its strongbox, but for exactly this kind of book sitting in its captain's cabin, the same instinct that nearly cost an earlier crew their most valuable find entirely. Back when a stack of Spanish charts almost went over a rail because nobody recognised paper as plunder, Elias keeps a spare copy, water-stained but legible, wrapped in oilcloth in his own sea chest, because he has watched, more than once in his career, a ship's entire navigational confidence collapse the moment its only almanac got soaked through in a bad squall. Night sailing brings its own instrument, one that doesn't need the sun at all. Somewhere north of the equator, on a clear night, you learn to find Polaris, the North Star, sitting almost motionless near the top of the sky while every other star appears to wheel slowly around it. Its height above the horizon, measured with the same backstaff used at noon, gives you your latitude just as reliably as the sun does, arguably more simply, since Polaris barely moves and needs no almanac correction to speak of. Elias shows you a second small instrument that first week too, a nocturnal, a flat brass disc with a rotating arm. used to read the time of night off the position of the Big Dipper as it swings around the pole star like the hand of an enormous, silent clock. Watch her turn, he tells you, gesturing at the sky with the same casual authority he'd use pointing out a familiar street. She's kept better time than any watch aboard this ship for longer than either of us has been alive. It's a small, strange comfort, learning to tell the hour from stars that have been doing this same slow rotation since long before anyone thought to build a ship at all. Here's the bad news, and Elias doesn't dress it up any more gently than the truth deserves. Everything you've just learned, the backstaff, the almanac, the North Star, the nocturnal, solves exactly half the problem of knowing where you are, and it's the easier half. Longitude, your position east or west, has no equivalent sky trick in 1718. Not one any sailor aboard this ship, or frankly any sailor anywhere in the world, can reliably use. Working out longitude accurately requires comparing local time, measured by the sun's position, against the exact time back at some known reference point. And that requires a clock accurate enough to survive weeks at sea without losing or gaining more than a few seconds, a piece of technology that simply does not yet exist. England's Parliament, in fact, will pass an act in 1714, just a handful of years before tonight's voyage, offering a staggering cash prize up to £20,000, an almost unimaginable sum for the period, to anyone who can solve the longitude problem reliably. Word of that prize has already reached sailors like Elias, second-hand, garbled slightly in the retelling. And it tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the problem is taken by people with real money to offer. Out here, tonight, none of that prize money helps you one bit. You sail down a known latitude instead, hold your ship along that single confirmed line east or west, until dead reckoning suggests land should be near, and then you watch the horizon like your life depends on it, because, quite literally, it does. It isn't only Elias taking sights, and this turns out to matter more than you'd first expect. The quartermaster keeps his own backstaff, older and slightly worse for wear, and takes his own noon reading, most days out of what he'd probably describe, if pressed, as simple professional habit rather than distrust of the sailing master. More often than not, the two readings agree within a mile or two, close enough that nobody bothers mentioning it. Once, about a month in, they don't agree at all. A full 8-mile gap that has both men checking their instruments, checking the almanac, checking each other's arithmetic, with the kind of careful, unhurried patience that would surprise anyone who pictures pirate crews as men too reckless to double-check their own math. The discrepancy turns out to be a smudged number in the quartermaster's older almanac, a printing flaw nobody had caught in years of use. It's a small incident, quickly resolved, but it lingers in your memory as a demonstration of the exact thing Elias keeps repeating, without ever quite phrasing it as a lesson. Trust the sky, certainly, but trust it best when two different men, using two different instruments, are willing to argue with each other until the numbers actually agree. A fishing boat hailed off a low, sandy coast a few weeks later brings you a story second-hand, the kind of tale that travels ship to ship faster than any official report ever could. The fisherman, an older man missing most of his teeth, tells your boarding party about a merchant vessel out of Bristol that sailed this same stretch of water 2 seasons back, confident in her reckoning, running her latitude west toward a landfall her officers were certain lay dead ahead. She struck a reef nobody aboard had charted, 40-some miles from where her own navigator swore she ought to be, at night, in weather that gave nobody time to correct course. The fisherman shrugs through most of the telling, the way people do with news that stopped feeling urgent to them personally, but Elias, listening from a few feet away, goes very quiet, and doesn't say much of anything for the rest of that watch. He doesn't need to. Everyone standing near him already understands exactly what he's thinking, because it's the same thought sitting behind every noon sight he's ever taken. Stories like the Bristol wreck were common enough, in one form or another, that the longitude problem wasn't some abstract mathematical curiosity debated only by scholars in London coffeehouses. It killed people, regularly, in ways that were only ever pieced together afterward, if at all. A far larger, better documented catastrophe, would strike a Royal Navy squadron off the Isles of Scilly in 1707, only a handful of years before tonight's voyage, when Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel's fleet, sailing home in poor visibility and trusting a longitude estimate that had drifted badly astray, ran straight into rocks that should have been nowhere near their charted course. 4 warships were lost that single night, and estimates of the dead range as high as roughly 2,000 men, a disaster so shocking to the English public that it's widely credited, alongside years of quieter losses like it, with pushing Parliament toward the Longitude Act just 7 years later. Elias has heard the story told and retold by older sailors, details shifting slightly with each version the way they always do, but the core of it never changes, a fleet that trusted its reckoning too completely, in weather too poor to correct it, paid a price that dwarfs almost anything a single pirate crew could suffer. It's not a comforting story to hear this far from land. It isn't meant to be. By your final weeks aboard under Elias's instruction, something in him has visibly worn down further, and it isn't just his eyes. A bad storm 3 weeks back kept the sky hidden for 11 straight days, longer than anyone aboard had gone without a confirmed sight in living memory, and you watched him age through that stretch, in a way that had nothing to do with the calendar. When the clouds finally broke and he got his sight, hands not quite steady, and it came back close enough to the dead reckoning position to matter, something in his shoulders visibly loosened, the whole ship exhaling with him though nobody said a word about it. The crew, without any formal vote or announcement, had quietly started giving him the easier night watches those last few weeks. The shorter stints, someone always positioned near enough to read a strained instrument for him if his eyes gave out entirely mid-sight. It's not written anywhere in the ship's articles. It didn't need to be. A man who has spent 25 years keeping an entire crew from running onto rocks they never saw coming earns that kind of quiet, unspoken care. Whether the paperwork accounts for it or not, there's a particular kind of quiet that settles over the deck on the clearest nights, the ones where the whole sweep of stars is visible edge to edge with nothing to interrupt it, no city glow, no haze, nothing but the mast swaying gently against a black field scattered with more light than most people living on land will ever actually see in their lives. Elias doesn't say much on those nights. He doesn't need to. He simply stands near the rail with his battered nocturnal in hand, checking the hour against the slow, patient rotation of the Big Dipper, and there's something almost reverent in how carefully he does it, the same careful attention a much later generation might bring to a fine instrument built for a laboratory rather than a heaving deck. It occurs to you, watching him, that this entire system, the backstaff, the almanac, the North Star holding almost perfectly still while everything else in the sky slowly turns around it, has been quietly available to anyone willing to learn it since long before any nation existed to guard it as a secret. Unlike the captured Spanish charts of an earlier voyage, painstakingly hoarded for a century and a half by a crown determined to keep them locked away, the sky has never once asked permission from anybody to be read. You think, standing there, of the Bristol wreck and the wrecked squadron off the Scilly Isles both, of 2,000 men who never got the chance to stand on a quiet deck like this one and simply watch the stars turn, and you find yourself, without quite meaning to, grateful for something as small and ordinary as a clear sky and a patient old man willing to teach you how to read it properly. What you take from your weeks under Elias Pryor's instruction isn't really the backstaff, or the almanac, or even the strange patient comfort of the nocturnal ticking off hours by starlight. It's the plain fact that half of navigation, out here, in 1718, is simply knowing exactly how much you don't know, and respecting that gap with everything you've got left. Elias can tell you, with total confidence, precisely how far north or south this ship sits on any clear day. He cannot tell you, with anything close to that same confidence, how far you've travelled east or west, and neither can anyone else alive. That gap, that stubborn, unsolved half of the puzzle, is exactly what sent entire fleets of pirates hunting for a different kind of answer altogether. One that had nothing to do with instruments at all, and everything to do with knowing, from patient years on the water, exactly when and where the wind itself was guaranteed to blow. Some of the most successful pirate voyages ever recorded were planned not around a chart or a sextant sight at all, but around a calendar and a working knowledge of when an entire ocean, half a world away, reliably changed its mind about which direction it wanted to move. Elias's stars could tell a ship where it stood on any given night. They couldn't tell a crew where an entire fleet of Mughal treasure ships would be sailing 4 months from now, or when. For that kind of prediction, one pirate captain in particular would need to trust something even older and, in its own way, even more reliable than the compass, the wind itself, and the seasons that governed it with almost mechanical regularity. Smoke rolled low across the water off the coast of India in September of 1695, and aboard a ship called the Fancy, a Bristol-born captain named Henry Every watched his best gunner adjust his aim toward the mainmast of the largest vessel either man had ever seen afloat. The ship they were fighting, the Ganges Sawai, belonged to the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb himself, one of the wealthiest rulers on earth, and she was returning from Mecca loaded with pilgrims, merchants, and by most surviving accounts, an almost unimaginable quantity of gold, silver, and jewels. She was also, on paper, nearly untouchable. Dozens of guns, hundreds of armed men aboard. Built and crewed to deter exactly the kind of attack now underway. Every's gunner fired. According to several accounts of the engagement, the shot found the Ganges Sawai's mainmast, and the massive ship, suddenly crippled, began to lose the fight nobody expected her to lose at all. To understand how Every's crew came to be waiting in exactly the right patch of ocean on exactly the right week of the year, you have to start with the Fancy herself, and with a mutiny that had nothing to do with treasure at all. In 1694, Every served as first mate aboard an English privateering vessel, then named the Charles II, anchored off the Spanish coast. Her crew increasingly furious over unpaid wages, and a captain they'd stopped trusting. Rather than wait any longer, Every led a mutiny, took command of the ship, renamed her the Fancy, and set sail not toward England but toward the Indian Ocean, a body of water that, by the 1690s, had become notorious among English sailors for one specific seasonal opportunity, the annual pilgrim and trading fleet that sailed between the Mughal Empire's ports and the Red Sea port of Mocha, carrying goods, pilgrims bound for Mecca, and, on the return leg, wealth substantial enough to tempt any captain willing to take the risk. This is the story of Henry Every, the Fancy, and a piece of navigational knowledge that had nothing to do with instruments or charts at all. The simple, seasonal, almost calendar-like predictability of the monsoon, which handed a small band of pirates the exact season, and very nearly the exact date, of the richest ship most of them would ever lay eyes on. Here's the thing about that fleet that made it different from almost any other target a pirate could hope to intercept. Its schedule wasn't really a secret at all, in the way a Spanish derrotero had been a generation earlier. It was dictated by physics, by the seasonal reversal of wind patterns across the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean that sailors of the region, and eventually European traders operating alongside them, had understood and depended on for centuries. Every summer, the southwest monsoon set in with almost mechanical regularity, driving ships eastward and northward from the Red Sea toward the Indian coast. Every autumn, as that wind pattern weakened and eventually reversed, the return journey home became possible again. A merchant fleet that wanted any hope of a safe, timely passage simply had no real choice about when to sail. The wind decided the calendar for them, and had decided it, reliably, for longer than anyone could remember. Every and the small, loose collection of pirate captains operating in those waters that year, including a New York-based captain named Thomas Chew, who'd made a similarly lucrative raid in the same waters 2 years earlier, understood this better than almost anyone. They didn't need a spy in Surat or a stolen manifest to know roughly when the Mughal fleet would attempt its passage. They needed a calendar and patience. Chew's own earlier raid in 1693 is worth pausing on, because it's essentially what proved the monsoon strategy could work at all before Every ever attempted his own version of it. Chew had sailed from Rhode Island with a single ship and a modest crew, intercepted a large, richly laden vessel, believed to belong to the same general Mughal trading network somewhere near the same Red Sea approaches, and returned to the American colonies with a fortune so large, reportedly worth many thousands of pounds, divided among a crew of barely 60 men. That word of it spread through colonial ports within months. That single successful voyage did more to establish the pirate round as a viable, repeatable strategy than any amount of theoretical knowledge about monsoon winds ever could have on its own. Sailors' talk. Fortunes made overnight get discussed at every tavern from Newport to Nassau, and by the time Every gathered his own crew 2 years later, he wasn't improvising a new idea. He was following a route other men had already proven, timed by a wind pattern that had never once, in living memory, failed to arrive on schedule. The crew that gathered under Every's command in 1695 numbered somewhere around 150 men by most estimates. A genuinely international mix of English, Danish and Dutch sailors, bound together not by nationality or any shared origin, but by the same written articles that governed crews across this entire chapter's stories. A share of the eventual prize, voted terms of command, compensation scaled for injury, the same basic framework that had carried Bartholomew Sharp's crew around Cape Horn 14 years earlier, governed this far larger, far more ambitious voyage too. It's worth remembering, amid all the drama of monsoon winds and captured treasure ships, that none of this happened by pure individual daring. It happened because men agreed, in writing, to share both the risk and the reward of a strategy built entirely around understanding a season nobody could control, but everybody could predict. By the middle of 1695, Every had gathered his own ship together with several others into a loose, temporarily cooperating fleet, an arrangement common enough among pirates hunting the same seasonal prize that historians sometimes refer to the whole informal circuit as the pirate round. They positioned themselves near the mouth of the Red Sea, close to the narrow strait of Bab el-Mandeb, the single choke point any fleet sailing out of Mocha toward India would have to pass through. It's worth pausing on how little of this required sophisticated navigation in the sense the earlier chapters of tonight's story have described. Every didn't need a precise noon sight to find the Mughal fleet. He needed to know, with reasonable confidence, that an enormous, richly laden convoy would attempt to pass through one specific narrow stretch of water sometime within a predictable window of weeks, and then simply wait there, provisioned and ready, for as long as it took. The ocean itself, through the monsoon's stubborn seasonal rhythm, had done most of the actual navigational work for him. The waiting wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't without cost. According to accounts pieced together from surviving depositions and second-hand reports that reached English authorities later, Thomas Tew was killed during an engagement with a ship believed to be part of the same Mughal convoy, struck by cannon fire in a battle that some accounts describe in grim, specific detail, though the precise circumstances remain disputed across different surviving sources. Every's own fleet, meanwhile, spent weeks tracking and finally engaging first the Fata Muhammad, a smaller vessel from the same convoy, boarded with comparatively little resistance and found to be carrying a substantial quantity of gold and silver in her own right. It was, by most standards, already a successful raid. It was nothing compared to what waited a short distance further along the same stretch of coast. The Ganges Sawai appeared on the horizon not long after, and here the story returns to the scene that opened this chapter. Every's gunner finding her mainmast, the massive ship losing steerage at a critical moment in the fight, and what should have been a badly mismatched battle turning, improbably, in the pirates' favour. By most surviving accounts, the engagement that followed lasted for hours and was genuinely brutal, the Ganges Sawai's far larger crew and heavier armament nearly enough, on paper, to have driven off Every's smaller force entirely. What actually decided it, according to the depositions later gathered from captured crew members, was a combination of that early damage to the rigging, confusion among the Mughal ship's defenders, and simple grinding persistence on the part of Every's men, who kept pressing the attack even as their own casualties mounted. When the Ganges Sawai finally struck her colours, her captors found exactly the kind of wealth rumour had promised them: gold, silver and jewels that, once eventually divided among the crew back at their base on Madagascar, are estimated by most historians to have made this one of the most profitable single pirate raids of the entire era, each ordinary sailor's share reportedly running into the hundreds of pounds, an almost unthinkable sum for a common seaman at the time. What happened aboard the Ganges Sawai in the hours after her capture is the part of this story that later accounts and later governments could not simply let fade quietly into legend. Surviving depositions and second-hand reports describe serious violence against the passengers and crew still aboard, including women travelling with the Pilgrim fleet. Violence severe enough that word of it reached the Mughal court in a form that horrified Emperor Aurangzeb and threatened, almost immediately, to unravel English trading privileges across the entire subcontinent. This is not a detail history has softened with time, nor should it be softened here. Whatever swashbuckling glamour later got attached to Henry Every's name, the raid that made him briefly the most wanted man in the English-speaking world came at a documented human cost that the surviving record does not allow anyone to look away from entirely. The diplomatic fallout arrived almost as fast as the plunder did. Aurangzeb, furious and, by most accounts, deeply humiliated by an attack on a ship carrying his own subjects home from a religious pilgrimage, ordered English factories and trading posts in India temporarily shut down and threatened far harsher consequences unless the English crown produced the men responsible. The East India Company, whose entire business in the region depended on Mughal goodwill, found itself in the extraordinary position of funding what amounted to one of the first large, coordinated manhunts in English history, a substantial reward offered for information leading to Every's capture. Wanted notices circulated across English ports and colonies alike. It's worth putting that manhunt in some perspective, because it genuinely was unusual for its time. Royal proclamations naming Every specifically went out across England and its American colonies, describing him in enough physical detail that ordinary tavern keepers and port officials were meant to recognise him on sight, and the reward offered for his capture, by most accounts, ran into the hundreds of pounds, a sum that would have tempted plenty of men who'd never dream of turning in an ordinary pirate for free. In short, an empire on one side of the world and a kingdom on the other had both, independently, decided that catching this one specific captain mattered enough to spend real money and real diplomatic capital on the effort. And still, for all of that, he was never caught. Several members of his crew, scattered in the aftermath as the fleet dissolved and men went their separate ways, were eventually brought to trial in London in 1696, and 6 were hanged that November, their depositions surviving today as some of the clearest first-hand accounts historians have of the entire raid. What happened to the ordinary men who avoided that fate is a quieter story, and in some ways a more human one than the manhunt for their captain. Several dozen of Every's crew, according to surviving colonial records, made their way to the American colonies in the months after the raid, some settling under assumed names in places like Philadelphia and Boston. Using shares of Mughal gold to buy respectability, land and silence in roughly equal measure. A handful reportedly negotiated informally with colonial governors willing to look the other way in exchange for a generous bribe, the same rough arrangement Every himself is said to have used in the Bahamas before vanishing entirely. It's an uncomfortable thing to sit with, if you're looking for a tidy moral to this story, violence committed against people who never consented to be part of anyone's raid, followed, for at least some of the men responsible, by decades of quiet, unremarkable, even comfortable life on the other side of an ocean nobody ever asked them to cross. History doesn't always resolve into justice. Sometimes it just resolves into silence, and a name slowly forgotten. Henry Every himself was never among them. After making landfall in the Bahamas and reportedly bribing a colonial governor for safe harbour, he scattered his crew, split what remained of the treasure, and, according to the historical record, simply vanished. Some accounts place him briefly in Ireland. Others suggest he may have quietly returned to England under an assumed name and lived out his remaining years in obscurity. His fortune, if he still had any of it left by then, apparently squandered or hidden well enough that no trace of it, or of him, was ever conclusively documented again. it remains, genuinely, one of the great unsolved mysteries of the entire pirate era. A man briefly infamous enough to be named in royal proclamations across 2 empires simply stopped appearing in any historical record at all, and nobody, to this day, can say with confidence what became of him. There's something worth sitting with in how differently this raid worked compared to the story of the captured Spanish charts told earlier tonight. Bartholomew Sharp's crew needed a stolen document, a physical object smuggled home across an ocean, to solve their navigational problem. Every's crew needed nothing that could be stolen or lost at all. Their advantage was simply knowledge of a rhythm, the monsoon's reliable seasonal reversal, understood by regional sailors for centuries and picked up by English pirates willing to learn from exactly the kind of local expertise European empires too often dismissed. It's a quieter, less dramatic kind of navigation than a sextant sight or a captured chart, but it was, in its own way, just as precise. Every didn't need to know exactly where the Ganges was on any given day. He needed to know when the wind would eventually deliver her, more or less, to him. The irony, and there's a real one here worth pausing on, is that the very raid that made Every infamous also helped push English maritime institutions toward taking monsoon science more seriously than they ever had before. In the decades following the Ganges raid, the East India Company invested increasingly in systematic study of Indian Ocean wind and current patterns, publishing more detailed sailing directions for the region, partly to protect its own increasingly vulnerable shipping from exactly the kind of ambush Every had pulled off, and partly because a trading empire that size simply could not afford to keep relying on informal sailor-to-sailor knowledge passed down through taverns and second-hand stories. Piracy, in a strange and roundabout way, helped fund and motivate some of the same careful, systematic navigational science that would eventually make raids like Every's far harder to pull off in the first place. The wind hadn't changed at all. The people studying it, finally, had started paying proper attention. The wind kept its schedule, as it always had. Long after Every's own name faded from active pursuit into legend, and eventually into a kind of pirate folklore, only loosely tethered to the documented facts. Ships kept sailing the pirate round for years afterward, other captains attempting to repeat a version of the same monsoon-timed ambush with wildly varying success. And the Mughal court's fury over the Ganges raid reshaped English trading policy in the region for a full generation. But the underlying navigational lesson, buried under all the drama and the manhunt and the 6 men hanged in London, was almost embarrassingly simple. And it's worth carrying forward into everything that follows tonight, sometimes the most reliable chart available to a sailor with no instruments at all isn't drawn on paper. It's written into the sky itself, in the seasonal patience of a wind that has never once missed its appointment, and it can guide a ship just as surely toward triumph as it can, in exactly the wrong hands, toward disaster. There's a particular kind of awe worth sitting with here, separate entirely from the violence and the fortune and the manhunt that followed it. An ocean covering roughly 1/3 of the Earth's surface, moved twice a year in each direction by a single vast, predictable breath of shifting air pressure over an entire continent, reliable enough that sailors with no clocks, no charts of the open water, and no way of fixing their longitude could still plan an ambush timed almost to the week, 4 months in advance, based on nothing but pattern and patience. It's easy to imagine dead reckoning and celestial navigation as the clever human inventions in this story. The compass, the backstaff, the almanac, each one a small triumph of ingenuity over an indifferent ocean. The monsoon offers a quieter kind of wonder. Nobody invented it. Nobody could take credit for it. It simply existed, vast and patient and entirely indifferent to who used it, waiting for anyone curious enough and humble enough to actually learn its rhythm before it decided everything for them anyway. Consider, too, just how many different people had to first understand that rhythm before an English mutineer ever thought to exploit it. Arab, Gujarati and Malay sailors had been timing their own trading voyages around the same seasonal reversal for centuries before any European ship ever entered the Indian Ocean at all. developing a body of practical meteorological knowledge that European trading companies would spend generations slowly, often arrogantly, catching up to. Every's raid wasn't really a triumph of English seamanship over an unpredictable ocean. It was, more honestly, an act of borrowed knowledge, learned second-hand from exactly the kind of regional expertise a colonial mindset, too often dismissed as primitive, then turned into a weapon against the very trading networks that had refined it in the first place. There's no tidy moral in that either, only the plain, slightly uncomfortable fact that some of the most valuable navigational knowledge in this entire story never belonged to the people who ended up profiting from it most. That same wind, so reliable across an open ocean, meant nothing at all in the one kind of water where a sky full of stars and a hold full of stolen Mughal gold couldn't save a ship from her own captain's carelessness. Water so shallow that navigation stopped being a matter of angles and instruments entirely, and became instead a matter of trained eyes reading the colour of the sea itself. The water changes colour before anything else warns you, and it happens so gradually that you almost miss the exact moment it turns from the deep, endless blue of open ocean into something paler, greener. Close enough to translucent in places that you can suddenly see your own ship's shadow sliding across pale sand many feet below the surface. This is the Bahama Banks, a vast shallow maze of coral heads, sandbars and channels, barely deep enough for a laden sloop, stretching for miles between islands that barely rise above the waterline, and it is, in 1717, one of the single best hiding places available to any pirate crew in the Atlantic world. Precisely because almost nothing about it can be navigated the way open ocean can. Your captain doesn't reach for the backstaff here. He doesn't bother with the noon sight at all today. Out here the sky is nearly useless. What matters is the colour of the water directly ahead, and the man standing at the bow reading it like a language, because a Royal Navy frigate with too deep a draught literally cannot follow you into water this thin, and everyone aboard your ship knows it. Here's the thing about sailing the Banks that takes real getting used to. Distance and depth stop being separate problems and become, for practical purposes, the same conversation, running continuously between the man at the bow and the man at the helm, with no room for the kind of slow, deliberate calculation Elias Pryor taught you back on open water. Pale, sandy bottom shows through as a bright, almost luminous turquoise, deep enough usually for safe passage. Darker green patches mean grass beds, still passable but worth watching. Brown or mottled patches, though, mean coral heads rising close enough to the surface to tear the bottom clean out of a hull, moving at any real speed. And a good bow lookout can spot that danger from 100 yards out if the sun's angle cooperates, and a bad one can miss it entirely if it doesn't. Congratulations, you've traded one set of instruments for a completely different skill, one that lives entirely in trained human eyes rather than brass and glass. And it turns out to be just as demanding, and just as easy to get catastrophically wrong. The man doing most of that reading on your ship is called Cato, a name given to him by a Bermuda merchant who once claimed to own him, and has, since a chaotic afternoon 18 months back, involving a boarding action and a crew vote nobody bothered to record formally. No further claim on him at all. Cato sails now under the same articles as every other man aboard, entitled to the same share, and he happens to be, without much competition, the single most valuable set of eyes on this ship in water like this. He grew up working small boats around these islands before ever setting foot on a pirate sloop, learning to read reef and shoal the way other children learn to read a printed page, and he has a habit, when the water gets genuinely tricky, of going almost completely silent, calling depth and hazard in short clipped phrases instead of his usual easy chatter, as though the concentration itself doesn't leave room for anything extra. The rest of the crew has learned to listen for that silence as its own kind of warning. By your second hour easing through this stretch of the Banks, the lead line comes back into constant use, swung by a second man standing amidships, calling soundings in a steady rhythm that Cato listens to without ever quite looking away from the water ahead. Out here the tallow-packed lead isn't confirming a distant coastline the way it did on open passages. It's confirming, foot by foot, whether the very patch of water directly beneath the hull right now still has room enough to pass through, and the margin for error, in some of the narrower channels, runs to a matter of a few feet rather than a few miles. 3 weeks into this particular cruise, working these same banks in a loose, informal patrol pattern, you've learnt the specific cadence of a call that means safe water and the subtly different cadence of one that means slow down immediately. And the gap between those two sounds, spoken by the same tired voice in the same rough accent, has started to matter more to you than almost any other sound aboard the ship. Here's the thing about why anyone bothers navigating water this genuinely dangerous in the first place. It's exactly the danger that makes it valuable. New Providence, the island town most sailors simply call Nassau, sits near the edge of this maze of banks and shoals, and by 1717 it has become, by most accounts, home to somewhere in the range of 1,000 or more pirates at various points, drawn there specifically because larger, more heavily armed vessels, the ones representing formal law and formal navies, simply cannot follow a shallow draft sloop into water this thin without running aground themselves. Welcome to one of the only genuinely safe harbours available to men living entirely outside the law, protected not by cannon or fortification, but by a labyrinth of coral and sand that only local knowledge, patiently accumulated over years, can reliably navigate. It's the pirate version of knowing the back roads better than the highway patrol, except the stakes, out here, run considerably higher than a traffic stop. Cato's own knowledge of these waters, it turns out, comes from a trade older and, in its own quiet way, more respectable than piracy, wrecking. Long before he ever sailed under a black flag, entire communities scattered across these islands made their living legally salvaging ships that had misjudged exactly the kind of shallow water you're currently threading. Families passing down detailed knowledge of specific reefs and channels across generations, because a wreck in the wrong hands, or the right ones, could feed a household for a year. Cato learned to read water the same way a farmer's son learns to read weather, because his family's actual livelihood depended on knowing precisely where a heavily laden merchant ship was most likely to come to grief, and precisely how to reach the wreck before any rival crew did. There's an uncomfortable irony worth noting here. One Cato himself brings up, without much prompting one evening, the same patient, generations-deep local knowledge that once helped his family profit from other ships' navigational mistakes, is now the exact skill keeping your own ship from becoming somebody else's salvage. By your 5th week on the banks, a low bank of cloud building fast on the southern horizon sends Cato scrambling for the nearest deep water anchorage he knows within reach, moving with an urgency that has nothing to do with any Navy patrol. Storms that build this fast this late in the season, he explains in short, clipped sentences while the crew hurries to strike sail, can turn this shallow, sheltered maze of banks into one of the most dangerous places on the entire ocean to be caught. Because there's no room here to simply run before the wind the way a ship might in open water. A hull that draws even a few extra feet, pushed by a hard enough gust into water it wasn't built for, can ground and break apart in weather that a deep water ship might have ridden out with nothing worse than a rough night. You spend the next 6 hours anchored fore and aft in the lee of a low island barely large enough to block any wind at all, listening to rain hammer the deck and feeling the hull strain against her cables, and it occurs to you, somewhere in the middle of that long, wet, frightened night, that the same shallow water protecting this ship from the Royal Navy is entirely indifferent to whether it drowns you instead. By the 3rd week of this particular patrol, word reaches Nassau by way of a fast sloop from a friendly captain that a former privateer named Woodes Rogers has been appointed by the Crown to sail for the Bahamas with a royal pardon in one hand and a small fleet in the other, tasked with shutting this whole informal pirate republic down for good. It's 1718 by the time that news actually arrives in force, and it lands on the town like a held breath finally released, everyone aboard your ship aware that the very shallows currently protecting them will only keep protecting them for so long against a governor determined enough to bring in pilots of his own. Rogers, by most accounts, understands the value of exactly the kind of local knowledge Cato represents better than most Crown officials sent to deal with piracy before him, and word already circulating through Nassau's taverns suggests he intends to hire local pilots and reformed wreckers himself, turning the very expertise that has sheltered this pirate haven for years into the tool that finally exposes it. Cato hears this particular rumour without much visible reaction, though you notice he goes quiet for the rest of that evening, turning the same weathered lead line over and over in his hands, without actually casting it. For now, though, on this particular afternoon, the immediate danger isn't a Royal Navy fleet at all. It's a coral head Cato somehow doesn't call out in time. The ship doesn't strike it, not quite, the keel scraping close enough that everyone aboard feels the shudder travel up through the deck boards and into their own feet, a sound less like an impact and more like a long, low groan wood against stone. Cato goes rigid at the bow, and for one genuinely frightening second, nobody says anything at all. Then the water deepens again beneath the hull, the groan stops, and the ship eases forward into clear water on the other side. No real damage done beyond a few scraped planks that the carpenter will grumble about for the next 2 days. Cato, when you finally look at him, has gone pale under his own weathered colour, and it's the quartermaster, not the captain, who crosses the deck first to put a hand briefly on his shoulder and say something too quiet for you to hear. Whatever it is, it's enough. Cato exhales, nods once, and goes back to calling depth in that same clipped, careful voice, though it takes a good hour before the easy chatter in his calls fully returns. That near miss becomes, in its own quiet way, the thing that finally makes the rest of the crew understand exactly what they owe him, in a way that abstract gratitude never quite managed before. According to the ship's articles, a serious injury sustained in the ship's service, a lost eye, a lost limb, carries a set compensation paid out of the common stock before any other shares are divided. A documented practice across pirate crews of this era that made the risk of the trade at least partially bearable. Cato's near miss cost him nothing physical at all, but the vote that follows that evening, informal and unanimous, to give him a slightly larger cut of the next prize taken specifically for his work reading these waters, isn't required by any article written down anywhere. It's simply what the crew decides, together, that his skill and his nerve are worth, and it's a small, specific kind of dignity that a population-level statistic about pirate crews sharing risk could never quite capture on its own. By the 4th week, the ship needs careening, hauled over onto her side in shallow water so her hull can be scraped clean of the weed and barnacle that have been quietly slowing her down for months. And this, too, turns out to be a task that depends entirely on reading water rather than measuring it with any instrument. Cato picks the spot, a shallow, gently sloping stretch of sand well clear of any coral, and the timing of the whole operation depends on the tide as much as anything else. The crew waiting for the exact window when falling water will leave the ship's exposed side high enough to work on without stranding her outright when the tide turns again. Get the timing wrong, and a careened ship can find herself either still floating, useless for the work, or badly hard aground when the water drops further than expected. Cato reads the tide the same patient way he reads the reef, watching the exposed sand at the waterline, judging the moon's phase, cross-checking against a rough tidal almanac the quartermaster keeps for exactly this purpose. It's slow, unglamorous work, and it's also the kind of work that keeps a ship fast enough to outrun the Navy vessels that can't follow her into water this thin in the first place. Here's a smaller trick Cato teaches you almost as an aside. One afternoon threading a particularly narrow channel between 2 low, scrubby islands. The transit. Line up 2 fixed points on shore, a distinctive dead tree and the corner of a ruined watchtower, say one behind the other, and as long as the 2 stay perfectly aligned in your sight, you know you're holding the exact centre of a safe channel, invisible though it is beneath the surface. Let the near point drift even slightly to one side of the far point, and you know, instantly and precisely, which direction the ship has wandered off the safe line, correcting before the coral ever gets the chance to prove the mistake for you. It costs nothing. It needs no instrument beyond a pair of trained eyes and a landmark worth remembering. And it works, according to Cato, exactly as well today as it did for the fisherman who taught it to him as a boy. decades before any pirate ship ever needed it half so badly. The storm passes by early morning, leaving the banks calm and pale blue again by the time the sun climbs high enough to read the water properly, and Cato, exhausted, allows himself something close to a smile when the anchor finally comes up clean and undamaged. There's a specific kind of relief that settles over a crew after a night like that, quieter than celebration, closer to simple gratitude that the ordinary world is still there in the morning. Nobody talks much over the first meal after. Nobody really needs to. You've all just watched, together, exactly how thin the margin can run out here, and exactly how much a single set of trained, patient eyes was worth in keeping that margin from closing entirely. That gratitude, small and wordless as it is, sits differently with you than the earlier fear did. Somewhere in the space between the coral head Cato nearly missed calling and the storm he steered you clear of entirely, you've stopped thinking of him as simply the man assigned to read water, and started thinking of him as something closer to the actual reason this ship, and everyone still breathing aboard it, made it through this particular stretch of the voyage at all. It's a small shift, barely worth remarking on out loud. It's also, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of shift that held a pirate crew together better than any article ever written down on paper. By your final week working these banks under Cato's instruction, you've come to see the whole maze of shoals and channels differently than you did on your first frightened afternoon watching the water change colour beneath the hull. What looked, at first, like an indistinguishable expanse of dangerous shallow nothing turns out to be, to a trained eye, as legible and as full of landmarks as any city street. Every coral head and grass bed and sandbar carrying its own name and its own history in Cato's memory, passed down from fishermen and wreckers who worked these waters generations before a single pirate flag ever flew over Nassau's harbour. There's something worth sitting with in that inheritance. The instruments you learned earlier this voyage, the compass, the backstaff, the almanac, all came from distant workshops and printing houses in London, built by men who never once had to sail the water they were equipping others to survive. Cato's knowledge came from nowhere but here, refined by people who had every reason to know these shoals better than anyone who ever tried to chart them from a comfortable desk an ocean away, and it turns out, that kind of hard one. Hyperlocal expertise can outperform the finest instrument money can buy, provided a crew is humble enough to actually listen to the person who has it. It is also, as Rogers's approaching fleet makes plain, exactly the kind of expertise a determined enough enemy can eventually learn to buy or borrow for himself, which means the advantage these shallow banks currently offer is not permanent. However safe it feels tonight, anchored quietly in water no larger ship would dare to follow you into. Not every ship that trusted its own instruments quite so completely over local knowledge came away as fortunate as yours. And not every captain, faced with a choice between an experienced local pilot's warning and his own stubborn certainty, chose to listen. A little further up the coast, in shallower water not so different from the banks you've just spent weeks learning to read, one particular pirate captain would soon discover exactly how unforgiving a shifting sandbar could be to a crew that misjudged it, whether through simple bad luck or, as some would later whisper, through choices made quite deliberately by the one man aboard who stood to gain, the most from his own ship running aground. The grinding started low, almost gentle. A shudder felt through bare feet on deck before anyone actually heard it. And within a few seconds the ship that had, until that exact moment, been the single most powerful pirate vessel operating anywhere along the American coast was no longer moving at all. It was early June of 1718, near a shallow shifting channel at Beaufort Inlet on the coast of North Carolina, and the ship hard aground on the sandbar was the Queen Anne's Revenge, flagship of Edward Teach, the man the entire Atlantic seaboard had, by then, learned to call Blackbeard. Roughly 300 tons of former French slave ship turned heavily armed pirate flagship, mounting somewhere in the range of 40 guns by most estimates, sat motionless in water barely deep enough to float her, her crew scrambling on deck as a smaller sloop nearby, the Adventure, watched the whole disaster unfold from water shallow enough that she, at least, had no trouble floating clear. This is the story of the Queen Anne's Revenge, the ship that made Blackbeard's reputation, and then, in a single confused afternoon, effectively ended his career as a major fleet commander, and the genuinely unresolved historical argument over whether her grounding was simple bad seamanship or something far more calculated. To understand how a ship this large and this heavily armed ended up stranded on a sandbar in her own home waters, you have to go back to how Blackbeard acquired her in the first place, and it isn't a flattering start. In November of 1717, Teach's crew captured a French slave ship called La Concorde off the coast of West Africa, a vessel that had already endured a brutal Atlantic crossing carrying enslaved captives, many of whom, according to surviving French accounts, had suffered severely from disease and mistreatment even before pirates ever boarded her. Teach took the ship for himself, converted her for war rather than the slave trade, fitted her with additional cannon, and renamed her the Queen Anne's Revenge, transforming what had been an instrument of one horror into the flagship of another kind of predation entirely, a detail worth sitting with rather than glossing past, since it's easy for the swashbuckling version of this story to skip straight to the cannons and the black flag, without asking where either one actually came from. Over the month that followed, Blackbeard built a genuine small fleet around this flagship, and by the spring of 1718 he commanded, by most accounts, several vessels and several hundred men. Enough combined firepower to blockade the port of Charleston, South Carolina outright that May, holding the town's shipping hostage for supplies and medicine in an episode that made his name known and feared. Across every English colony on the coast, it was by any measure the peak of his career, a level of organised naval force that few pirates of the entire Golden Age ever came close to matching. And then, within a matter of weeks, most of it was gone, run aground on a sandbar that local pilots working these same waters every day of their working lives would have known to avoid. Here's where the story genuinely splits, and it's split historians and popular writers for 3 centuries since. The straightforward version says simple bad luck. Beaufort Inlet's sandbars shifted constantly, poorly charted even by the standards of the day, and a ship as deep-drafted as the Queen Anne's Revenge, attempting to navigate in unfamiliar water without a qualified local pilot aboard, was always at real risk of exactly this kind of accident, the same kind of risk this very night's earlier chapter on the Bahama Banks made plain in vivid detail. Congratulations, in this telling you've simply watched an ordinary navigational disaster, the same kind that claimed merchant ships and naval vessels alike throughout this entire coastline every single year. The other version, considerably more calculating, suggests Blackbeard grounded his own flagship on purpose, along with a second vessel shortly afterward, specifically to strand and abandon a large portion of his crew, roughly 200 men, by some estimates, on a nearby sandy island, allowing him to sail off with a much smaller, hand-picked group and a disproportionate share of the fleet's accumulated plunder, having no further obligation under the ship's articles to split it with several hundred fewer surviving partners. The evidence for the deliberate version isn't conclusive, and honest historians say so plainly rather than presenting it as settled fact. But the circumstantial pattern is suggestive enough that it's kept the argument alive for 300 years. Blackbeard, according to surviving accounts, had recently negotiated a royal pardon for himself, and was actively working to reduce his crew and consolidate his wealth around the same period the Queen Anne's Revenge went aground. A second, smaller vessel ran aground, attempting to assist her almost immediately afterward. An oddly convenient coincidence, if it was purely accidental, and in the weeks that followed, Blackbeard did indeed sail off with a much smaller crew and, by most reconstructions, a considerably larger personal share of the fleet's treasure than an even division among several hundred men would have allowed. None of it proves intent beyond doubt. All of it, taken together, has kept marine historians arguing about the exact moment this chapter opened on for longer than most of them would probably like to admit. Among the roughly 200 men left behind on that sandy, marooned stretch of coast, historical records preserve few individual names with any real detail, though the general outline of what happened to them is documented well enough to reconstruct in broad strokes. Most were eventually able to make their way to shore, or were picked up by passing boats, stranded rather than drowned, though stripped of most of the fleet's accumulated wealth, and left to fend for themselves along an unfamiliar stretch of Carolina coastline with whatever provisions and small craft happened to be available. It's worth imagining for a moment what that morning actually felt like for an ordinary sailor among them, someone who had signed the ship's articles in good faith, taken his share of the risk at Charleston and everywhere else this fleet had raided, only to watch his own captain sail off toward the horizon with a fraction of the crew, and, by most accounts, the lion's share of everything they'd all taken real risks together to earn. Whatever loyalty had bound this crew together through months of genuine danger, it apparently did not extend, in Blackbeard's own case, much further than his own immediate advantage when the moment came to choose. Blackbeard himself didn't have much longer to enjoy whatever advantage that manoeuvre brought him. Within months, in November of 1718, he was killed in a fierce, close-quarters battle off Ocracoke Inlet against a Royal Navy force led by Lieutenant Robert Maynard. His head reportedly severed and displayed from the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop as proof the threat had genuinely ended. A grim, theatrical end befitting a captain whose entire public reputation had always leaned as heavily on deliberate, cultivated terror as on any actual navigational or tactical genius. The Queen Anne's Revenge, meanwhile, stayed exactly where she'd grounded, slowly breaking apart and settling into the sand and silt of Beaufort Inlet. Forgotten by name within a generation, her precise location lost to history for the better part of 280 years. She surfaced again, in a manner of speaking, in November of 1996, when a private research team working with the state of North Carolina located a wreck site roughly a mile and a half off Beaufort Inlet, buried under sediment in relatively shallow water, and began the slow, painstaking work of determining whether this was actually the ship the historical record had all but given up on ever finding. The evidence accumulated carefully over the following years rather than arriving all at once. The sheer number and size of cannon recovered from the site, consistent with a heavily armed former slave ship converted for war. A ship's bell cast with a date consistent with the Concorde's known history. The general size and construction details matching contemporary descriptions closely enough that North Carolina's underwater archaeology program eventually felt confident designating the site officially as the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, catalogued as Site 31 CR 314, one of the most extensively studied pirate shipwrecks anywhere in the world. What divers and archaeologists eventually pulled from that sediment, painstakingly, over decades of careful excavation, reads like a physical index of everything this entire chapter has been about. Sounding leads, still packed with fragments of hardened tallow after nearly 3 centuries underwater. Navigational dividers, the kind used to walk distances across a chart. Fragments of at least one sandglass, its wooden frame long since rotted away, but its shape still recoverable from the surrounding sediment. These weren't treasure, not in the sense popular imagination usually means when it pictures a pirate wreck. They were tools, ordinary and workmanlike, the exact same category of equipment described in painstaking detail back at the very start of tonight's story. Recovered now not from a working ship's deck, but from the quiet, patient work of archaeologists determined to understand exactly how a vessel like this actually functioned, rather than simply how she looked flying a black flag. The scale of the excavation itself is worth a moment's pause. More than 24 cannon have been recovered from the site over the decades of ongoing work, along with tens of thousands of smaller artefacts, from cannonballs and grapeshot to surgical instruments, pewter plates, and even fragments of West African gold dust, believed connected to the ship's earlier life as the Concorde. A detail that ties this entire wreck back to the same brutal Atlantic slave trade the ship served before Blackbeard ever claimed her. Conservators at facilities including East Carolina University and the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort have spent years stabilizing individual objects that would otherwise crumble to dust within hours of exposure to open air. a single cannon sometimes requiring more than a decade of careful desalination before it's considered stable enough for public display, submerged first in fresh water for months at a stretch simply to leach out centuries of absorbed salt before any conservator dares expose it to open air at all. It is, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of painstaking, unglamorous work that would have felt entirely familiar to Josiah Fenn casting his logline back at the start of tonight's story, careful, repetitive, and absolutely essential to getting the details right. There's something worth sitting with, hearing all of this centuries later, in the fact that the objects surviving best from Blackbeard's flagship aren't the ones that made him famous. It isn't the black flag, long since rotted away to nothing, or any personal effect definitively tied to the man himself. It's the sounding leads and the dividers and the sandglass fragments, the same humble, overlooked instruments described chapter after chapter tonight, the tools that quietly did the actual work of keeping a ship afloat while the captain's reputation did all the loud. Dramatic work of terrifying an entire coastline. Reputation faded within a generation of Blackbeard's death. The instruments, buried in sand and silt for nearly 300 years, are still here, still legible, still telling their own quiet, patient story to anyone willing to dig carefully enough to find them. One of the documented men who survived the grounding and the split that followed it was Israel Hands, a member of Blackbeard's crew who, according to surviving accounts, was shot and permanently lamed by his own captain in an unrelated dispute sometime after the Beaufort Inlet incident, Blackbeard reportedly firing on him under the table during a night of drinking simply, in his own words as later recorded, to remind the crew who commanded them. Hands was later captured and, unlike his former captain, managed to negotiate a royal pardon by testifying against other pirates, living out the remainder of his life, by most accounts, in considerably reduced circumstances in London. It's not a story with a clean moral. It's simply a documented example of exactly the kind of casual cruelty and precarious loyalty that sat underneath even the most successful pirate crews of the era. The same written articles promising shared risk and shared reward, doing very little to protect a man, once his own captain decided that risk no longer applied to him personally. Hans's later willingness to testify against former shipmates in exchange for his own pardon says something too, about how thin the bonds forged under duress or fear can turn out to be once survival itself is finally on the table. Even the modern history of this shipwreck managed to produce its own small, strange legal legacy, one that has nothing to do with pirates at all, and everything to do with copyright law. The excavation itself, worth noting, is still not finished, nearly 3 decades after that first 1996 discovery. Archaeologists have deliberately worked in phases, recovering artifacts a small batch at a time, rather than rushing the site, partly out of respect for how fragile waterlogged wood and iron become the instant they're exposed to open air, and partly because a wreck this significant simply rewards patience over speed. Roughly a third of the site, by some estimates, still remains unexcavated on the seafloor as of recent years, meaning that some future audience, quite possibly listening to a very different kind of story than this one, will eventually hear news of fresh discoveries pulled from the exact same stretch of sand, where a badly commanded, possibly betrayed crew once scrambled ashore in June of 1718. 300 years is a long time for a story to keep adding new chapters. This one evidently still has a few left to tell, and every fresh cannon or fragment of tallow-packed lead pulled carefully from that sediment adds one more small physical correction to a story that has spent centuries being told mostly through legend, rumour, and the occasional exaggerated courtroom deposition. A videographer named Rick Allen spent years documenting the excavation and later discovered the state of North Carolina had used some of his footage without paying for a license, leading to a lawsuit that eventually reached the United States Supreme Court in 2020. A case popularly nicknamed Blackbeard's Law by the legal press covering it, which ultimately ruled that states generally retain sovereign immunity from private copyright suits. It's a strange, almost absurd footnote to attach to a ship that spent most of its working life either enslaving people across the Atlantic or terrorizing merchant shipping along the Carolina coast. And yet there it sits, a genuine piece of 21st century American lore, traceable in a fairly direct line back to a sandbar Blackbeard's ship struck nearly 300 years earlier. It's the kind of detail that would sound implausible in fiction, a pirate flagship's accidental grounding eventually shaping the outer boundaries of modern copyright doctrine, and it's true anyway, which is very often how the strangest footnotes in real history tend to work. What lingers longest, though, thinking back over this whole strange arc, from a captured slave ship to a pirate flagship to a sandbar to a modern archaeological site generating modern Supreme Court cases, isn't the scale of any single moment in it. It's the sheer patience the whole story demanded from everyone who touched it honestly. Patience from the archaeologists spending a decade desalinating a single canon. Patience from historians still arguing, carefully and without false certainty, over whether a grounding was accident or betrayal. And patience, 3 centuries earlier, from roughly 200 abandoned men on a sandy Carolina shore, left to find their own way home after the captain they'd trusted decided their shares mattered less than his own convenient exit. Some kinds of navigation, it turns out, have nothing to do with instruments at all, and everything to do with simply enduring long enough to be found. There's a particular kind of dread worth naming plainly in this story, separate from the grim theatre of a severed head on a bowsprit, or the slow violence of the slave trade sitting underneath the ship's entire origin. It's the dread of trusting a captain, a crew, an entire written contract of shared risk, and discovering, on one ordinary morning, with the tide running out beneath the hull, that the person holding real power over your survival has quietly decided your life is worth less than his own convenience. That particular betrayal doesn't announce itself with cannon fire. It arrives as a grinding shudder felt through bare feet on a deck, and then, worse, as the sight of your own captain's sails shrinking toward the horizon, and it is, in its own quiet way, a more universal kind of fear than anything a black flag or a fearsome nickname ever managed to conjure on its own. It's worth remembering, though, before letting that dread settle too heavily, that Blackbeard's own crew was, by most accounts, unusually large and unusually loosely bound even by the standards of pirate fleets in this era. Several hundred men across multiple ships rather than the tight single-vessel companies of 80 or 100 that governed most of the other stories told tonight. The larger a crew grew, the easier it apparently became for a captain to treat the written articles as a formality rather than a genuine bond, and the harder it became for any single ordinary sailor to hold him accountable to it. Smaller crews, bound by tighter, more personal versions of the same contract, more often kept faith with each other precisely because betrayal on that scale was harder to hide and easier to punish. It isn't a comforting distinction. It is at least an honest one, and it's worth carrying forward into the story of a much smaller crew, and one man forced into it against his will. That waits just ahead tonight. Not every navigator aboard a pirate ship signed on willingly. Some were taken by force, valued for their skill and threatened with violence if they refused to use it. And the story of one such man, pressed against his will into exactly the kind of navigational duty this whole night has been built around, waited until now to be told in full. Rope burn first across both wrists, before you've even fully understood what's happening to you. The smell of gun smoke still hanging over the deck of the merchant sloop you'd been serving aboard for 6 honest years, and the sound, underneath everything else, of a captain you don't recognise asking a question you understand perfectly well is not actually a question at all. Which of you can read a chart properly and work a backstaff and keep an honest reckoning? You raise your hand before you've decided to, some instinct towards self-preservation outrunning your own better judgment, and that single gesture is the entire reason you're now standing on the deck of a pirate sloop, instead of watching your own ship sail on without you, your former shipmates too relieved at being spared to look you in the eye as the boarding party herds you toward the rail. Here's the thing about being taken this way that nobody explains clearly until you're already living it. There's an actual documented legal category for men in your exact position, and it matters more than you'd expect. Pirate ships of this era commonly distinguish, at least in principle, between volunteers who sign the ship's articles freely and forced men taken specifically for a needed skill. A distinction that will matter enormously if this ship is ever caught and its crew put on trial. The quartermaster explains it to you within your first hour aboard, almost gently, in the tone of a man laying out rules rather than making threats. Your name goes into the ship's book as forced. You do the work asked of you, and if the Navy ever catches this ship, your best hope of hanging alongside men you never chose to sail with rests entirely on other members of this crew being willing to testify, honestly, that you never had a real choice in the matter at all. By your third day aboard, you meet the only other man in a position anything like yours, a ship's surgeon named Thomas Kellaway, taken forced from a different prize almost a year earlier, who has, in that time, developed the particular flat, careful way of speaking that you're already starting to recognize in yourself. A man choosing every word with the awareness that his freedom may eventually depend on exactly what gets remembered about how willingly he served. Kellaway shows you where to sling your hammock, warns you which of the quartermaster's moods mean genuine danger and which mean nothing at all, and tells you, without much drama, that the work itself will probably be the easiest part of what's ahead. Do the sums honestly, he says, checking a wound on a young topman's forearm as he talks, not looking up. Keep the ship off the rocks. Nobody aboard actually wants you dead, provided you're useful and you don't give them a reason to think otherwise. It's not comfort exactly. It's the closest thing to comfort available to you right now, and you take it. By your second week, you're doing the work in earnest, casting sights with a backstaff not so different from the one you used honestly aboard your old merchant ship, keeping a private reckoning the quartermaster checks against his own each evening, without much comment either way. There's a strange, disorienting normalcy to it that unsettles you more than outright hostility would have. The math doesn't care who's asking for it. A noon sight taken under duress produces exactly the same latitude as one taken freely. And there's something almost obscene about how easily your own competent hands keep doing the job regardless of how you got here, as though your body has decided to cooperate with a situation your mind still refuses to accept. By the fourth week, a storm catches the ship badly off a lee shore, the kind of weather where an honest reckoning genuinely means the difference between clearing the rocks and losing the ship entirely. And you find yourself working the problem with a focus that has nothing to do with loyalty, and everything to do with simple animal self-preservation. Because you'll drown just as surely as anyone else aboard if you get this wrong. When the ship finally claws clear of the shoreline by what you calculate afterward to be less than half a mile, the quartermaster claps you once, hard, on the shoulder, the closest thing to genuine warmth you've seen from him yet, and says only, "Good numbers." You don't feel proud of it, not exactly. You feel something more complicated and considerably harder to name. A kind of grim satisfaction tangled up with the knowledge that you've just used your own competence to keep a pirate ship afloat. And that competence, whether you like it or not, is starting to matter to you. News reaches the ship second-hand, months later, by way of a captured merchant captain who'd heard it in a Caribbean port, about a very different crew, several hundred miles away, that had been captured and put on trial at Cape Coast Castle on the West African coast, the largest single piracy trial of the entire era. According to the merchant's account, over 100 men from that crew stood accused, and a significant number of them argued they'd been forced men exactly like you, some producing witnesses among their own former shipmates willing to confirm it, some unable to find anyone left alive to speak for them at all. The outcomes split sharply. Some forced men were acquitted outright. Others, despite genuinely having been taken against their will, were convicted and hanged anyway, undone by nothing more than the bad luck of not having the right person alive and willing to testify on their behalf. You listen to this story with a coldness settling somewhere behind your ribs that has nothing to do with the weather, because it's the clearest evidence yet of exactly how thin the line is between the two futures currently available to you, and how little of that outcome will actually depend on the truth of what happened the day you were taken. That coldness sharpens into something closer to real fear about 2 months after that, when the quartermaster catches you deliberately underreporting the ship's speed during a difficult passage, a small, almost undetectable act of quiet sabotage you told yourself was simply caution. He doesn't strike you. He doesn't need to. He simply explains, in the same flat, patient tone he's used since your first day aboard, exactly what happens to men who cost this crew a prize through carelessness, or worse, through deliberate deception. And the specifics he offers are detailed enough that you don't sleep properly for most of a week afterward. You're forced, he tells you, not unkindly, which buys you a courtroom someday. Maybe. It doesn't buy you the right to get us all killed today. You go back to honest numbers after that, and you hate, more than almost anything else about this entire experience, how much relief you feel doing it. By your 8th month aboard, Kellaway takes a fever that won't break, caught, most likely from a wound he'd been treating on another man weeks earlier, and there is no physician aboard to treat the physician himself, beyond his own increasingly shaky instructions to the powder monkey assigned to fetch his medicines. You sit with him through the worst nights of it, less out of any deep friendship than out of the simple fact that he is the only other person aboard who fully understands what it means to be here against your will. And somewhere in those long, sweat-soaked hours, he tells you, in fragments between fevered sleep, about a wife and 2 children waiting in Bristol who have no idea whether he's alive or dead, taken from a merchant ship they'll never learn the name of. He survives, barely the fever breaking on the 10th day, and when he's well enough to sit up and take proper food again, the first thing he does is ask you to help him write a letter he has no real way of sending, addressed to a family who may never read it, simply so the words exist somewhere outside his own head. You help him write it anyway. It seems at the time like the only decent thing left to do. There's a strange kind of hope buried even in an arrangement built entirely on coercion, and it's worth naming honestly rather than pretending it isn't there. The same ship's articles that threaten you also, technically, entitle a forced man to a partial share of any prize taken, smaller than a volunteer's full share but real nonetheless, credited carefully in the ship's book alongside your forced status. It isn't freedom. It isn't anything close to what you'd have chosen for yourself. But it means that if this voyage ends in something other than a rope, you won't walk away from it with absolutely nothing, and there's a specific, complicated comfort in watching that small sum grow in the ship's ledger even as you count down the days until some Navy sloop finally catches up with all of you. That day comes 11 months after the one that started all of this, a Navy sloop running your ship down off a stretch of coast you recognise, with a lurch in your stomach as uncomfortably close to home. The fight is short and one-sided. By evening you're in irons in the hold along with everyone else, and the particular fear settling over you now has nothing to do with drowning or starvation and everything to do with a courtroom you haven't seen yet, months away, where your entire future depends on whether the right men are still alive and willing to speak for you. Kellaway is in the hold too, chained a few feet away, and in the dark, before either of you can know how any of it will end, he says the only thing that actually matters, I'll tell them what happened to you. Every word of it. You believe him, mostly because you've already watched him keep smaller promises than this one, made in worse conditions than these. And it turns out that's the whole of what you have to hold on to now. Not a compass, not a chart, just one man's word, and the same written record of your forced status that's been sitting quietly in a ship's ledger since the very first week of an ordeal neither of you chose. The trial itself, when it finally comes, is not the story tonight has time to finish. And honestly, it isn't really the point of this chapter either. What matters is the thing you carry into that courtroom regardless of how the verdict falls. 11 months of honest numbers. Kept under threat. Kept afraid. Kept anyway. Because the alternative was letting a ship full of men, willing and unwilling both, run onto rocks nobody deserved to die on. Somewhere in a stack of Admiralty paperwork, not so different from the trial records that decided Bartholomew Sharp's fate generations earlier, a clerk will eventually write down whether the word forced beside your name was enough to save you. Whatever that verdict turns out to be, it won't change the plainer truth underneath it. You never once, across 11 months and 100 careful sights. Let go of the difference between the man who took you and the work your own two hands were still doing honestly, for reasons that were entirely your own. Every method this whole night has walked through, the knotted logline, the stolen chart, the patient stars, the seasonal wind, the shallow water read by trained eyes, the written articles that bound, frightened, desperate. Sometimes unwilling men together anyway comes down, in the end, to the same plain fact. None of it was ever really about instruments. It was about people, doing careful, patient, frightened work in the dark, refusing to let the not knowing become an excuse for carelessness, because somewhere beyond the horizon a coastline was waiting either to save them or to kill them. And the only real defence anyone ever had against that uncertainty was each other. Think, for a moment, back to that first night on the sloop, to Josiah Fenn's ruined fingers letting a knotted line run free into the dark, counting under his breath as though saying the number twice might make it truer. He never knew Bartholomew Sharp's name, or Henry Every's, or Blackbeard's. He never stood in a courtroom arguing over a forced man's fate, and he never saw the sun bleach charts his own careful counting helped keep safe from a reef nobody could see. He simply cast his log over and over into water that never once told him exactly where he was, and trusted that the counting itself, patient and imperfect and entirely human, was worth doing anyway. That's the whole of it, really. Every captain, every chart, every star this night has followed was only ever an extension of that same small, stubborn act, counting carefully in the dark and trusting the count, because the alternative was simply refusing to try at all. You're warm right now, your bed isn't moving beneath you, and no one is asking you to read a shoreline by starlight or gamble 300 lives on a pencil mark that might be wrong. Josiah never got a night like this one. Neither did Cato or Elias or the forced man counting knots in irons, waiting on a verdict he couldn't control. But you do tonight, and there's something worth resting in, knowing how much patient, frightened, careful counting it took, across 3 centuries of dark water, just to get all of us safely to shore. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.